We're trying to amplify light into the world.
Yes.
Peace, light and love. Om Shanti. Okay, let's get going.
Right.
Action. Start at the beginning. So, what inspired you to start Serenity and Leadership?
What inspired me? Well, it's kind of a long story.
We've got time.
Because I've worked in the corporate world for 28 years. And before that, I was a Royal Marine for 17 years. So I've seen a lot of people in power, and the people that really stand out to me are the people who didn't abuse their power. They were people who inspired followership by the way that they were, which was essentially based in humility and also a sense of peace. I remember one of my old bosses who led one of the companies in 4-5 Commander during the Falkland War, and he taught me so much. And I remember occasionally, a couple of times, I really messed up, and I would go to him and say, "Colonel, I'm really sorry, but I've done this, that, and the other." And he would look at me and say, "We'll go and sort it out." And it was like this. There was no tirade. There was no great expression of energy or anger. It was just, well, here we are. What have we got to do about it? That it's that sense of serenity. That it's that sense of leaders who come from a place of serenity within themselves, who are connected to a deeper level of themselves, who don't lead through their ego. They don't lead because they need to feel in charge. They don't lead because they have some need to be seen to be in charge. They're not ego-less, but they are not driven by their ego. Those are the leaders who are the most effective. I was talking to someone the other day, and they were saying the ego is the biggest liar of them all, and the heart does not lie, the gut does not lie. So being in touch with the aspects of oneself which really help you to see what really truly needs to be done and how to do it. You don't have to think about it, and that's the serenity piece. I still haven't answered your question, really. I've been interested in gender and gender differences, gender dynamics, and so on for a very long time. Maria Graças da Silva gave this speech at OTC, the Offshore Technology Conference, in 2013, where she was speaking as a CEO of Petrobras, and she was. I think there were an awful lot of women in the room because it was a sort of a being a woman in a man's world type subject, and there weren't very men there. But she talked about abuse, and she talked about how she had to fight her way up the organisation and the effects that had on her, and how she'd brought up her two daughters whilst being successful in the business. And her fundamental message was, this is not for the women, this is for the men. It's for the men to start taking responsibility for the way that they behave in organizations. And she wasn't being exclusive of women. What she was saying was, women can fight this battle forever, but until men stand by them and work with them, nothing's going to change, really. And that's where we are. People are fighting for equality. I just don't think that's the right objective.
Because we shouldn't be fighting, or because equality is not something we should be striving for?
Well, I take it as read that when we talk about equality of pay or equality of value, if whatever the gender of the person, if they're doing a particular piece of work, it should be rewarded equally. But I think what that does is leak into the whole sort of feminist argument about men and women being equal, and I don't think they are. I think we're different, and it's a little bit like saying an apple and an orange are equal. They're both fruits. We're both human beings, but we're different. And I think that the bit that we're missing is creating an environment where the best of both can be expressed.
So seeing the difference as strengths, if they are nurtured and supported to flourish in that way.
Yeah.
And how men and women can work together with their differences if their differences are seen as strengths.
Totally.
And that perhaps a lot of feminine qualities that, you know, we will talk later about the feminine and masculine, but if I suppose we're both under the idea that the feminine is repressed in most workplaces, and it is the qualities of feminine that we are missing today when it comes to listening and compassion and creativity and intuition.
All of those. And I think it's very sad that an awful lot of women who are successful do it by expressing their masculine, not their feminine. And I think that's why, you know, I said the other day, you could have a team of all men, and if within that team there were men who were very much in touch with their feminine and were expressing that, and it was balancing some of the masculine all amongst those men, that would probably be a brilliant team.
But equally, then you run the risk of losing the experience of what it's like to be a female, a woman, and how that informs. And
I think that would be so welcome if that came in, but the whole system suppresses that, it quashes it, or it just rejects it, it pushes it away. So, yeah.
Because there are two levels then, aren't there? There's kind of our experience in a society, in a culture that gives us certain narratives around what it means to be a man and a woman, and then our abilities to call upon different qualities that we have chosen to label feminine and masculine, and how those can be used to their best advantage in a workplace or personal life. And the marriage of those two perhaps is what Serenity could be a little bit about in a context
which is actually why when we set up Serenity, the original aim was to have a retreat, and it was called The Gladiator and the Goddess Unite, which was trying to acknowledge the great strengths that there are in both the masculine and the feminine.
But I suppose Serenity took a different path from that original idea, and can you just talk a little bit about why it went on a different path?
Well, I think the fundamental aim of Serenity and leadership remains the same, and that is to attract leaders and influencers, people who, through their behaviour, affect the lives of a number of others, bringing those people together to help them explore what they have suppressed. And really essentially saying, well, what would it be like if you were fully expressed? If you as a man, for instance, could really feel into and be vulnerable. Like, you know, because I think for a lot of men that just feels seriously scary. But that's just the way that we've been conditioned. And yet it's that vulnerability that enables them to be open to other people. It enables them to really listen. It enables them to have an empathy to others. And so they're not just focused on their own stuff. They're focused on what is what is the effect that they're having? You know, in the corporate world, one of the things that I find myself very often asking a leadership team is, okay, you've made this decision. It's a very exciting decision. You're going to do this. You're going to take over that. You've got this new strategy. You're going to go into this new market. Whatever it is, tell me what the unintended consequences are of your decision. And the masculine would say, never mind that. We've got a plan. Let's go for it. But to take the time to explore actually what are the consequences of what we're deciding, you have to have a sense of vulnerability and willingness to challenge yourself to do that. And then you've got to have a sufficient openness that if you then say, well, actually, the unintended consequences of this are actually not that terribly good, to then say, well, okay, maybe this plan wasn't so brilliant after all, actually. Or when you're lost, and the woman will say, well, why don't we stop and ask directions? And the man will say, no, we're fine. We'll manage. I think we're on the right road. And it's just this willingness to be open to being wrong, actually, without and I guess just face up to the ego that says, no, you can't show weakness here. If you stop or you ask for directions, you're being weak. It's a very powerful word, the word weak. They do these, what they call it, SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. That weakness bit takes people into not a terribly good place, and it's often the least filled in box, because you're showing all sorts of vulnerability by exploring that.
Okay.
What was the question?
The question was, what inspired you to start Serenity in Leadership? And I suppose there's a few reflections there. One being responsibility and people owning their responsibility, but then not having to do that alone, and operating from the heart and maybe the intuition, not so much the mind. But when you're in that space, I think you are more vulnerable to self-doubt in a way, because your mind can trick you into thinking that you have the right answer. And we live in a very complex, fast-paced time. So do we really have time and space to tune into different levels of understanding?
Well, a lot of leaders would say you don't. I don't have time for this. Give me the answer, then we'll do it. And one comes across that a great deal. So taking time out to actually review where you are and are you on the right road? And if you're not, it is now the time to ask whether there's a better route, or just keep going because you think that it's going to be okay. There is another thing in the creation of Serenity and Leadership, though, because I've been very affected by, in my experience, by people in power and their abusing power. And that started out when I had a very tough time when I was at boarding school. A headmaster who honestly took a great deal of pleasure, well, I think he did, in causing boys a lot of physical pain. In the first school, it was the masters who had the power and they wielded it, or the headmaster particularly. In the senior school, public school, it was the boys. It was the senior boys who had the power and they wielded it. And I can remember one who had, if you like, honour in the way that he managed the power that the system gave him. But I remember an awful lot of others who abused the power that they had, and so that sort of left its own mark on me, and so when I see people being abused in whatever way, it kind of it creates a huge impetus in me to say there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way. You can be successful without using people. You can be successful without abusing people. In setting up Serenity, what I wanted to do was to play a part in helping leaders see that there is a new way. It's not a new way. It's a healthy way of being, where it's not just about making money. When you employ people, you have a responsibility for them. You can't just use them. We've done that for a couple of centuries, at least, and the damage is everywhere. I think one of the things that we come across today is that because of the sophistication now in the therapeutic world, you see the impact that early experiences have on people, and because you can see it, we have a responsibility to prevent it happening, and where it is happening, to stop it.
So if one of those early experiences was your school years, do you think, were you never put in a position where you could have abused power in that system?
I don't know.
And do you think you had a conscious awareness around how power was being played out in that situation at that time, or only with reflection now?
If you'd asked me that question, I probably would have said yes, but I was in the experience, and going between surviving and loving the place, and it's a sort of this paradox of being in a beautiful environment with superb facilities and being desperately unhappy and intensely fearful. So fear was the major thing that I was sort of living with, and it was causing me to behave in a particular way, to avoid certain things, but at the same time there was a part of me that wanted to stand up to it, and yet I wasn't very successful at it. So it's like you keep sticking your head over the parapet, and someone keeps smacking you around the chops, and you keep doing. It's a sort of early definition of insanity. So I was a bit insane, I suppose, at school, from that point of view.
And it's interesting that you mentioned fear, because obviously fear is often a product of the misuse of power. So how do you think fear plays out in organisations where structures are misusing power?
There's no question that fear is a huge motivator for the people in power, because if they can see that they're creating fear, it makes it very easy for them to control them. And that you see this in politics, you see it all over the place right now. I mean, the whole Brexit drive and everything else, it all comes really from fear of either being ruled by someone that is making you do something you don't want to do, or fear that some terrible thing is going to happen to you. I remember running an offsite for a large organisation some years ago, and it was very clear to me that the way that the senior managers were running the business, they were creating fear throughout the rest of the business. And I wrote on a flip chart piece of paper this, I drew an elephant and put it in the middle of the room, and I said, they said, well, what's the elephant? And I said, well, what do you think it is? And I think one or two people got it, and they said, yeah, it's fear. I said, yeah, that's right. You are creating fear. And there was this sort of almost this riposte in unison. Oh, no, we're not creating. There is no fear in the business. In just the same way, funnily enough, if you phone up a CEO and say, look, we want to come and help you with the generation of fear and the way that power is expressed in your organization. We've done a lot of phoning around, and you get two standard responses. One, we don't have it here. It's not a problem that we've got, or we're dealing with it internally. So the openness, the willingness to explore is not there. Why not? Well, a lot of that is fear as well. But if you put a group of women, let's say, from that organization, take a smattering from a number of different departments, put them in a room, make it completely safe, completely anonymous, and say, all right, tell us about power and how power is being expressed in this organization. Do you feel safe, for instance? I'll lay you odds on, they'll say, no, we don't. We don't feel safe. And we feel not listened to. We feel abused. That's a big word. But we talked a little bit earlier about the senior leadership that might have really good intentions to create an environment which is inclusive, and there isn't any harassment, and there's no expression of dysfunctional expression of power and all that. But the middle management often are not in tune with that will. And what's more, a lot of senior management don't actually, honestly, want to hear the bad news. An enlightened leader will say, bring me the bad news first, then I can do something about it. But an awful lot, and I really have seen an awful lot of senior leaders who, they might say it, but their behavior when they're given something, it's almost always the messenger that gets shot. And so the important information messages don't get.
And it makes me think back to an original story about your commander, and how he was very serene in whenever you brought him a problem or a mistake. And so what enabled him to be calm in the face of mistakes or challenges that other leaders maybe don't have that ability, and that they see things as very negative when actually conflict can be an opportunity for learning. Challenges and failures can be reframed for growth. So there's always an opportunity for a positive outcome out of a negative situation. But does it link back to time, that they don't have time to deal with the bad news or the problems? Is that a pressure there?
It's a perception. It's very easy to say, I'm too busy, because everybody's got a ton of things that they need to do. But part of that is a prioritization, and part of that is, what's his name? The guy who used to be the chairman of ICI. He wrote a fantastic book about on becoming a chairman of a company. He said the first thing that you should do is spend 3 months on a beach, really thinking about the organization and where it's going and stuff. So, really investing time, because that time is so well invested. And of course, there's a very big difference between a chairman and a CEO, because the CEO is under pressure from the shareholders and all the pressures that they're under. I remember coaching a CEO years ago, and he was the third CEO that year, because his predecessor had been fired. And he was terrified. He went into the job terrified, because the business was in a bit of a mess, and he'd been told to sort it out and do it fast.
But that makes me think, if you're going to spend 3 months on a beach thinking, and if you're being brought in to sort something out, it again reinforces the idea that a leader or a CEO is the one person with the answer. And I suppose I feel that part of Serenity is acknowledging that not one person has all the answers. So being able to ask for support when you need it, and
which is that expression of vulnerability that we've already talked about.
Yeah, but also if you're spending 3 months on a beach thinking, then what about talking to the people in the organisation and really not making assumptions on behalf of people, but understanding what people are really going through and how they really feel.
Yes, and if you look at all the really successful leaders, they're all people who surround themselves with people who are able to do the things that individual can't. So part of that is understanding what you're good at and what you're not so good at, and then you go out and find people who are good at the things you're not, which again is that piece of humility. The point about Harvey Jones going on the beach, John Harvey Jones, was that his point was, don't try and rush in there and change things. Look at the politicians and the leaders who are given, they're put in charge, and they feel this great need to make a difference, to make a mark, and do it quickly. Which is why you ricochet from one disaster to another. Look at the way that education is managed in this country.
Yeah, or the criminal justice system.
These are all people with good intentions and absolutely zero sense of longevity. And, you're just a little cog, with a big hat for a short while. And trying to make a huge change, either because you believe in it or because you need to make a big change because your ego needs it.
As opposed to working with what you arrive to and listening to people.
Yeah, listening. Really going out and listening. I mean, that's leads us on to the dialogue business.
Yeah, it does. Do you want to talk about that now, or do you want to talk about, why not, I suppose. So we have been doing an open series of dialogues. Dialogue is all about listening. And so I suppose, can you say a bit about why you've chosen to use this method of communication with people to explore these themes of gender and power and identity?
Well, you're the inspiration for that. And the reason that I think that dialogue is so important is that it's a way of bringing people together, for people to listen, but also for people to be heard. And we have a clash of men and women, and you talk about the battle of the sexes and all this kind of thing. All the time that people see this as a war, we're not going to get anywhere. It's not going to produce anything useful. And the other approach, which is to legislate, also, all you're doing then is closing the gate after the horse is bolted. What I fundamentally believe is that if we're going to change the way that men and women work together and be together, but particularly in the workplace, is by defusing a lot of the tensions that people are bringing in, which means that men have really got to hear when women, I don't like to say men and women like that, but because there's plenty of men. In fact, there's a lot more men being abused than people feel comfortable thinking about. Not as many as women, but nevertheless, the abuse happens both ways.
And of course, acknowledging that men and women, that male and female, there are other gender identity labels now that we are also navigating in terms of talking
which
about.
just makes the picture a lot more complicated. And it's another reason for people to be abused and excluded. So, yeah, it's having the dialogue, it's creating the safe space where people can come together and listen to each other, truly listen, and notice and be helped to notice when their biases and beliefs come up and start to make them think in a particular way. When people notice that, then you begin to get a change, because then they can make a conscious decision about listening to the person, as opposed to just hearing it through one's own filters, which is never going to produce a good result. So the abused, the harassed, whatever gender they are, need to feel listened to. And again, this masculine-feminine piece, the masculine wants to hear a problem and solve it. And actually what the feminine needs, in both men and women, what the feminine needs is just to be heard.
Yeah.
And then the whole, and you can see it actually, if you have the right environment, you can actually see a person's body relax as they feel like they have actually said something and been heard.
And I suppose the other important thing to mention is that it is a very non-judgmental space. And I suppose when putting that in an organisation that has a culture of fear, then the fear might be, what are the repercussions of me being open and honest in this space if I'm then going back into a culture that is controlled somewhat by fear? And so it's managing that tension, I suppose.
Which is why I actually believe that this change and the openness and the willingness to explore this has got to be done from the top down. You know, a lot of change initiatives actually work best when they come from the edges of an organisation, not from the top. The top's got to support it, they've got to create an environment, but change, when it's born at the edges of an organisation, actually is much more effective than some big change initiative that comes from the executive suite, the C-suite, or you like to call it. In the gender environment, I do actually believe it needs to start at the top, and the leadership have to explore their values, how they're living their values, and what their beliefs are, and then adopt behaviours that support where they actually want to go. So often a leadership team or the CEO or the head of HR will say, "Oh, come in and work with this department." And I'll say, "Yeah, I'll work with that department, but actually it's not going to make that much difference, because you've got a leadership that are behaving dysfunctionally, or they're not supporting this initiative and truly supporting it." And part of truly supporting it is that leadership holding the middle management really responsible for behaving in the same way. And that actually is a big challenge, not least because it takes a lot of management time to do that. It's one of these things where senior management will say, "Well, where's the value? You know, where's the effect on the bottom line? I can't see how we're going to save money or make money by doing this." And that's, for some, is quite a big leap, unfortunately.
So would you say that is one of the biggest challenges to bringing about change from a Serenity and leadership point of view?
Yeah, it's finding leaders who are really open to challenging themselves and exploring the impact that they are having. And really, it's like holding up a mirror to someone, because sometimes what you see in the mirror is, if you really look, it's not so good. So it's much easier to go out and solve other people's problems than solving your own.
Which is why we need a healthy dose of compassion.
Yes, compassion for oneself as well as for others.
Yeah, and understanding that we have to hold ourselves accountable and responsible, but at the same time, to really change, we need to do so in a space that is loving and non-judgmental, because that's when we allow ourselves to change, because we come out of defense mode into this openness to another possibility, another way of being.
Yes, and it's that word loving and love, and I was, as you said it, I was thinking the number of CEOs I've talked to, and well, the moment you get into this kind of stuff, look, that's woo-woo, or it's soft skills, or I don't run this company for love. I'm here to make a profit,
But then the other side of that is this, notion of psychological safety, and that teams that feel psychologically safe are able to take more risks and be more innovative, and that those are dependent on more soft skills and communication skills, and the skills that are often overlooked. So there, at some point, those two things have to meet.
I remember being called in by a new leader. I'd been working with his predecessor, and we had this communication and leadership program running, which had rave reviews. And the guy said to me, "This is not going to change them, is it? This program you're running?" And I said, "Well, actually, I think it probably will, yeah, because that's the idea." He said, "Oh, I don't want that. I want the guys making money." And he binned the program. And so, I mean, that actually, I think, is one of the great challenges in working in the corporate world, is that you do have someone who's enlightened or really wants to make a difference, and they start a program going, and then they get promoted, or they get moved on, or whatever, and the new guy comes in, and there's this desperate wish to impose their own ego on the thing, and they stop it.
But is that ego also driven by an expectation to achieve results by someone else?
Yeah, and when it's the CEO, it could be the board, and it could be the shareholders, it could be lots of things. Unfortunately, we're in a world where shareholder value has a value which is out of proportion to the whole of the system in which we're working. And it's not going to work long term. And we're now getting to a stage, and if you read Yvon Chouinard and that, he describes it very eloquently, how we are already getting to the stage where this short-termism isn't going to work. It's not going to work. But you've got to be able to take a step back from things, and for instance, to be able to say, well, yeah, I am the boss, and these are my short-term goals, but actually there's a long-term goal. It's more important, and I'm going to stand by it. And that may mean that shareholder value goes down for a couple of years, but actually long term it's what's needed. And some CEOs will get fired if they say that, which is sad, because those are the ones you actually need, who've got some sort of longer vision, which isn't just about making money. Because the making money piece, it's the same mindset that allows abuse. It's the same mindset that creates fear.
So, leadership is a hot topic right now. diversity and inclusion, gender, these are all kind of buzzwords, which we always have to have some caution around buzzwords, of course. So I suppose, what is it that makes Serenity and leadership different from other organisations that are helping and enabling and supporting leaders? And maybe some of the methods that Serenity and leadership use to achieve those outcomes.
So there are a lot of I want to react to something you said there, because you said leadership is a hot topic at the moment. Leadership has been a hot topic forever. Apparently there are more books written on leadership than there are on sex. So it's like, and you go to any bookstore at an airport, and you just, the books on leadership are there's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them.
But do you think we're redefining what leadership means?
I think that there are some. That's a good question. I like that question. There are some fundamentals that don't change, and then there are elements that do. The challenges that leaders face today are more complex, more challenging, and more difficult than I think they've ever been. And so the ability to see what is important and to be able to focus on that, and to discard an awful lot of the other things, is a great skill. And it is much easier to do that if your mind is not screaming at you and giving you all these different things that need to be done, because it's just distracting. You will see now that some leaders actually take time out to meditate. Richard Branson is a good example of that, where he takes small chunks of time during the day, no phones, no interruptions, just a quick sort of regrounding. That again is one of these sort of paradoxes where I'm so busy I don't have the time to do that, and yet if you gave the time to do that, you wouldn't be so busy. So leaders of this really brings us into what I felt was a fundamental when I created this business. I was lucky enough to go rafting down the Grand Canyon a few years ago, and just watching the canoeists go down the rapids. It's such a strong metaphor for me, because you can't really canoe back up again. So once you're committed, you're going. So you've got to go with the flow, and at the same time, you've got to make slight corrections, because otherwise you'll cream into a rock here or rock there or whatever. And so having that inner serenity to be able to hear your inner guidance tell you when to make those small adjustments will get you down there without grief. And the more that your head is cut into this, the more likely you are actually to come to grief. And one of the things that they always do before the big rapids is they stop and they get out and they go and look. And they look at the situation, where the real points of danger are, and then they come back in and then they go with it. So they give themselves the time to look at a situation from a broad place. They'll talk with their colleagues because other people will see things that they don't. These are all little metaphors for how I think leaders need to really face up to the challenges that they're facing. And then you go down, and it's just an amazing feeling of being in the flow and allowing yourself to just adjust in the moments, in the places where a small movement or adjustment creates all that's needed. And you do see leaders like that.
Except that they don't have the advantage of being able to look at the river first.
Well, you do and you don't. You do and you don't. And that's a little bit of the Harvey Jones going on the beach bit. Or, what was his name, the old CEO of Travellers that became Citigroup. What he used to do was to take his leadership team away once a month to this place they had where they just had sofas, and there was no agenda. They just talked in their own dialogue-y way, basically, not as you would lay down the rules of dialogue, but nevertheless, it was a place where people could say what they needed to say, and they weren't just shot down straight off. And it led to an incredibly successful business, because he wanted his leadership team to really talk to each other and be members of a leadership team, not just wearing the hat of the particular department that they were in charge of, but they were there as the leadership team. And that's kind of the same as going and looking at because each person has their own view and their own sort of filters that they see things through. Then you go back and you're working, another story coming up, but we'll hold that for another time.
So I'm not sure if that totally answered the question. Maybe it did metaphorically, but I suppose what is my sense of what makes Serenity different then is that every voice is heard and valued. It's explored from different perspectives. There's a deeper level of understanding. There's preparation and being in the moment and responding in the moment. Sort of, are these qualities that you hope to create in leaders? Are these conditions that you hope to facilitate in working environments? I mean, and how would you go about, obviously we've spoken about dialogue, but what other methods do you use to create this space, this conditions, this way of thinking, this way of listening, this way of decision making?
I don't think I could claim that this is a unique approach. I think one of the principles that I work on is that you have to honour the system. So that when you come in and you want to change everything straight away, you're not looking at the system. And what you do is you automatically generate a load of resistance. It's like not looking at the river and then steaming down it, and then you get into one of those things where you can get stuck forever. Because the system will resist you if you don't work with it. So what does that mean? That means that for me it's really important to go in and understand an organisation, understand what the leaders want to achieve, understand how the organisation is configured, whether that actually is mitigating for or against what the leadership want to achieve, understand timescales and therefore the pressures, but understand the unspoken and the unseen dynamics that are being lived out in the organisation. So coming in, acknowledging what is, acknowledging where you want to take the organisation to, and then having a view of the overall, and by that I mean, well, it depends on what the brief is, because sometimes you've actually got to look at what are the relationships with suppliers, what are the relationships with customers, what's the relationship with the community, what's the relationship with the environment. All of those things play a part. and maybe that's not part of the brief. So, but what we're trying to do is work with that wider system, because when you honour that and you acknowledge what it needs, then it's much easier to create change that actually works.
Mm. And I like that you use the word relationships in that sense, because that comes back to power and the power dynamic that is always at play in any kind of relationship, in any kind of situation that we know is not acknowledged or spoken about or named or understood. And by bringing that to the surface, then we can empower each person in that situation, hopefully, and bring about a flourishing on everyone's part.
Hallelujah, that's what you want.
Okay, so I think this is the final question then. And I suppose it is about what have we learned so far. So we're using a slightly different approach. We're taking time to be in dialogue with lots of different types of people to explore gender, power, different dynamics, and what are some of the things that have surprised you or enlightened you or transformed your thinking in any way or reinforced or reaffirmed any of your thinking?
So I think that one of the things that I have come to see is how complex the situation is, how how deeply complex it is. You can see the attraction for AI because you can program it, you can give it an algorithm, and you can say, right, do this, and it'll do it, and it's predictable. Whereas in the real world, we have human beings, and they're all unique, and they all have their strengths, and they all have their hang-ups. And how to get the best out of people means really listening to them and really suspending judgment. And I think one of the things that has come out a number of times for me during the dialogues is noticing my own judgments, or noticing how I'm surprised by something that someone said and not surprised by something someone else has said. And all that is about is my own experience. If somebody is saying something that I have experienced, then I can empathise and I can add to value probably to what they're saying because I've had my own experience of it. If I've never had that experience, then in order to add value, assuming that's what I was trying to do, I've got to start from an uninformed place.
But don't you think the value you're adding in that situation is just to listen to them?
Totally,
and understand?
Totally. But the male in me, is always wanting to find a solution. So the masculine in me. So I noticed that going on. It's part of my process, my function too, that I want to, if I see somebody suffering, to be with it is incredibly difficult.
Because you want to fix it.
Yeah. And of course that is something that happens over and over again. When somebody sees somebody suffering, what it does is it triggers your own suffering, which is why people try and stop someone's suffering when actually that might be the best thing for them because they can't deal with their own suffering. It's maybe a bit of a complex, complicated concept, but we see it lived out all the time. What else have I noticed? I've noticed that men don't want to come and have dialogues.
Some men do.
Yeah.
The brave, courageous men.
Right, and there aren't many of them. What it does is emphasise the openness that there is in the feminine to talk about an issue and to explore it for their own healing and for what they can contribute. I think, this is a theory, that typically the masculine wants to be given the problem and then I can solve it. And that's not what dialogue is about.
No.
So I think for a lot of men to just think that they're going to come somewhere and talk about something, in a talking shop, it's like, I've got better things to do. I could go down to the pub, or I could watch something on TV, or I could have a nice dinner. So one of the challenges we've had is framing this in a way that is more attractive to men, because we need men. We need the masculine coming in and giving their point of view, because women need to hear men, and we heard that in the very first dialogue really powerfully.
We've heard it in quite a few, I suppose.
Yeah.
And that's been a very powerful thing, that the amount of women that have acknowledged that they often dismiss men's feelings or don't think about what it's like to be a man in today's world, and therefore perhaps that leads into why men don't come, because they feel that part of themselves is dismissed. It's not welcome. That part of themselves that wants to be open and vulnerable is maybe not welcome, but we need to hear it, and women need to hear it, to feel compassion towards men in a culture and a climate that is often very hateful and accusatory and judgmental.
I think the word misogynistic is very destructive.
As is toxic masculinity.
As is toxic masculinity. Although someone used a different... They said it's not toxic masculinity, it's toxic humanity, which I thought was very helpful, because it happens from both sides. It really does happen because we had this whole thing about queen bees that's recently come up, where women actually can be much more unpleasant to women than men.
Yeah.
But I think this word misogyny, it's an unfortunate word, because it truly means the hatred of women. And I don't think, there's the incel world, which I think probably is misogynistic. But most dysfunctional expressions towards the feminine don't come from I hesitate to say this, don't come from a hatred, they come from a self-hatred and a fear of the self, which is then projected out onto women. And it's projected out typically by the use of power, so that there's a sense of domination which puts that fear and self-hatred to sleep.
And even with incel, we'd still have to question what led someone, they're not born with a hatred of women, so what led someone to that point? And I think that's the point, that going beyond, like we said, below and beyond what we're met with, to why, and the context that sits in culturally, from a family point of view, from an educational point of view, from the place of personal pain, and looking at that complexity and trying to bring understanding and compassion to each person, to meet them where they're at, with the knowledge that we're all capable of change, that we're all capable to change for the better or the worse, and it's the conditions that we create for that change to happen in that's the most important. We won't change if we feel that we have to defend ourselves, or we feel judged or shamed or guilty of something. We'll only change if we feel supported and understood and loved.
And you've sort of kind of gifted there the root of serenity in leadership, which is creating an environment where people feel safe to change.
That's convenient then, isn't it? I feel like that's a good place to stop.